Today I'm going to show you the basics of how to create a particle simulation by explaining what the basic components or the anatomy of a particle simulation is. In the vast majority of particle simulations, you have four main components. The most prominent component, the part that you're always going to have, is what's called the emitter. In this case, it's this flat plane right here, which is emitting particles, hence the reason why it's called emitter. And then the other type of objects you can have are collision objects, which the cube is a collision object because particles can hit that cube, and that cube can cause the particles to react to the impact. The floor or ground is also a collision object. Now the other main component to a particle system is force fields, and I'll get into that here in a minute. For now, I'm going to go ahead and stop this. I'm going to open up a new file. Alright, now what we want to do, I'm just going to go ahead and recreate what I just created. I'm going to drag this out just so everything is showing. I know I want to make the cube a collision object, so with the cube selected, go over here to the physics tab and then click collision. Now you have a couple of main settings that you will use most often. This right here, which is the dampening factor, that's how bouncy the particles will be whenever it hits it. If you don't want the particles to bounce at all, you turn it up to 1. If you want it to bounce some, put it about the middle. If you want it to bounce a lot, then you put it all the way down, but it will never stop bouncing if you turn it all the way down. So in this case, I'm just going to put it on 0.75. That way it bounces just a little bit. Now the particle friction, that's how much the particles will slide on that collision object. And in this case, I'm going to set that kind of low to 0.05. That way there is a little bit of friction, but not much. Now I'm going to go ahead and add the ground or the floor. Add a plane, and I'm just going to scale it up arbitrarily to about that size, and I'm going to drop it down just below the cube. Now I need to set the collision object or set the collision attribute on that also. I'm going to go ahead and set it to 0.75. Well, actually, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and set this one all the way up. That way, they bounce a little bit on the cube, but they won't bounce at all on the floor, so you can actually see the difference. I'm going to turn the particle friction up to 0.1, so it has a little bit more friction than the cube, but still not a whole lot. Alright, now what we need is the emitter. So in this case, I'm just going to use a simple plane to be the emitter. I'm going to raise that up. Now go over here to the particle system tab right here, and then click new. Now you have a whole bunch of settings here. Alright, this right here is how many particles is it going to create. In this case, I want it to create 10,000 particles. This is when does the particles start being created and when do the particles stop being created. This is in frames. So at frame 1 it will start producing particles, and it will produce them at the rate that at frame 200 it's done producing 10,000 particles. I hope that makes sense. Now you have a lifetime setting. This is also in frames. I'm going to go ahead and show you what I mean. Like if I set this to 10, that means once a particle is produced, that particle will stick around for 10 frames. See, only 10 frames only allows it to drop that far. But if I put it on 50, it will fall all the way down, but then soon disappears. But if I want them to stick around longer, then I can turn this up as high as I want. I usually turn it up quite a bit higher than what I actually need. Now, as you can see, it's continuing to produce particles, but they're not really reacting like actual physical particles. And that's because down here, we have it on, it defaults to Newtonian, and we actually want it to be on fluid. And see, now whenever it hits, it will build up and then tumble off the edge, kind of like a fluid actually would. Now, what we want to do, right now we just have like a generic orange speck that represents our particles. Now, if we want actual geometry for our particles, we need to add an icosphere or whatever other object we want to use as our particles. We can use pretty much any object, but the most commonly used particle mesh is an icosphere because it uses less computing power to simulate a whole bunch of them. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and put my icosphere on the second layer. Go to second layer, and then I'm going to add an icosphere. Now I'm going to go back to the first layer. Now, if I want to add a material to it, I can do that now, or I can do it later. I might as well go ahead and do that now. It doesn't matter. I'm going to go ahead and change over to cycles. I like cycles so much better. I don't have to set it up now. Just go ahead and assign it one. Now go back to layer 1. Right click to select your emitter. Go over to the particle system. And then down here, under the Render tab, click on Object, and now you can assign it the icosphere. And now, whenever each particle that it produces will be that icosphere. However we set the materials up on that icosphere, that's how the particles will be coming out of the emitter. So if I press play, we got little bitty icospheres coming out. Now if we want to change the size of those icospheres, we do it here. Because the size of the actual icosphere that we have right here will not make any difference. So let's just say, we'll go ahead and pause that, go back to the beginning. Let's just say 0.1. Make them twice the diameter. There you go. Now, a couple of things to take away from this. The more particles you add, or the more particles that it's producing, the slower your computer will become. 10,000 is enough for this example, but if you're doing like a actual fluid simulation, 10,000 ain't nowhere near enough. I mean, you would literally have millions. Now down here, this is a trick that a lot of people do. They click on display and then they change it from rendered to point and then click on size, because your system will preview it quicker if it's not having to build the geometry or the actual mesh for each individual particle, because it will render it the same. It will render the actual icospheres, but it previews much more quickly whenever you have it on point, and then check size. Now, there's a couple of different settings you can change also, and these can be fun. This is emitter. I usually put this on 0. It does funny things if you have it on anything other than 0, but that's my opinion. This right here is like initial velocity. Suppose I want the particles to shoot in the Z direction, straight up. I can change the Z to 1, and then that's, the best I can tell, that's 1 meter per second velocity. Or at least that's my understanding. So if I press play, it's trying to go up, but it just doesn't have enough speed because it's got gravity constantly pulling it down. So if I put this on 5, see, it's starting to go up. If I speed it up a little bit more, there you go. Now particles going up and then falling down. I can add a little bit of a Y direction to it also, which basically just means it's going to shoot up and over towards the Y axis. Simple enough, huh? And you can actually play with it like this, just sweeping back and forth by just dragging the mouse back and forth on the Y emitter. Alright. Now, you know, I said there was 4 main components to a particle system. I showed you the emitter, I showed you collision objects, and I showed you the icosphere that will be produced as particles. But there is another major component, and that is force fields. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and add a force field. The force field right now is in the center of this cube, but I'm going to go ahead and raise it, just stick it just above the cube, and go over here to the force field tab, and right now the strength is set at 1, and what will it do set at 10? Let's just simulate that, see what it does. And what it's doing, it's actually just forcing the particles up and away. Let's put it on 1. Has less of an effect. Put it on 2. Pushes it out just a little bit more. Put it on 3. A little bit stronger. 5. Now, here's the part that I like. Put it on a negative number. -10. And then all of a sudden it attracts the particles. And see, now I can move the force field around, like I can keyframe it or whatever, and I can kind of drag the particles around, because it will want to follow the force field, because the force field is pulling on it kind of like a magnet. So you can imagine all the different little things that you could do with the particle system. Because really all it comes down to is your imagination. What you can think of. You know, you're only limited by your imagination. And, of course, how powerful your computer is. Because, like I said, you start adding millions of particles, your system starts getting really slow. Now, I do want to go over one thing. If you start making your particles move really, really fast, or make them really, really tiny, you need to add subframes. And what subframes do, they calculate individual frames between frames. That way the particles will interact with each other and with collision objects more accurately. And ideally, you would want to have as many subframes as you could possibly stand. You know, as many as you are willing to wait, because the more subframes you add, the slower your machine's going to be. The more particles you add, the slower your machine or your simulation is going to process. But also, the more subframes you add, the more accurate the interaction will be. But anyway, I think that's pretty much the basics. If anyone wants a more detailed explanation of something specific in the particle system, let me know and I will try to explain it. As of right now, that's pretty much the basics, and if once you get the basic figured out, the rest of it you will figure out on your own for the most part. I mean, whenever I started trying to do particle simulations, I had no idea what I was doing, and I saw a tutorial where somebody explained just something similar to how I explained it, and once you get that part down, everything else will start falling into place. Here's one other thing, I forgot to mention this. When it comes to just 10,000 particles and 250 frames, you can get by without disking your cache. But it's always a good idea to disk your cache, or to write your cache to disk. Now, to do that, you have to click here, but in order to do that, you have to save your project first. File, save, and then I'm just going to rewrite over top of that. Now I can click disk cache, and it will take a few seconds. And then you have bake all dynamics, free all bakes, and then you have compression algorithms. If you have millions of particles, use your compression algorithms, either light or heavy. It will take a little bit longer on heavy, but you will save some disk space, unless you just have outrageous amounts of disk space. Because if you have like a 500 frame simulation with 10 million particles, if you don't compress it, you will have bake files the size of a good 300 or 400 megabytes per a frame. So if you multiply that by 500, you're talking 200 gig, something like that. No, 20 gig. But anyway, I usually put it on heavy if I'm simulating millions of particles. And once you get your simulation the way you want and you want to bake it, just make sure your file is saved, make sure this is checked, then click bake. And it will go through frame by frame, like it's doing right there, and simulating it. Of course, if you have millions of particles, it's going to be like one frame every 5 minutes. So, particle simulations take a lot of time, especially if you have a slower computer. And now that it's all on cache or on disk, if I actually save the program now, I can exit out of it and then go back. Where did I put it? I can go back to that file, click on it. It opened up on my second monitor. And then see, I still have my bake file. The cache is still there because it's on the hard drive. These are the bake files. And see how they get bigger the more particles are produced. So you got to keep that in mind also. Press play and there it goes. No baking to do, it's already there. But anyway, I've talked way too long. If you have any questions or want me to clarify something, let me know. Later, people.